My parents kept calling me the black sheep at the engagement dinner. Even the waiters heard them. My uncle asked, "What do you even do these days?" I looked around and said, "Own this entire resort." The room fell dead silent. I hadn't seen my family in years, and I preferred it that way. It wasn't that I hated them, exactly. Hate took energy, and I had spent too much of my life wasting energy on people who never thought I was enough. They thought I had ruined my life. And honestly, maybe I let them think that. It was easier than trying to explain myself to people who had already decided I was a failure. But then Camille had to go and get engaged. Camille, my perfect little sister. My parents' pride and joy. The one who had never once disappointed them. The one who never questioned their expectations, never strayed from their carefully planned out path. And now she was marrying a lawyer, someone from a good family, and my parents were over the moon. They sent out invitations like royalty announcing a coronation. One of those invitations landed in my inbox. I should have ignored it. I almost did. But something in me, maybe nostalgia, maybe foolish curiosity, made me RSVP. The engagement dinner was being held at a high-end resort, the kind of place my parents loved to be seen in. Elegant chandeliers, white tablecloths, and a wine list longer than some novels. As I stepped into the grand dining hall, I felt it instantly. That tension. That judgmental energy. Eyes flicked to me. A few widened in surprise. Others narrowed. I could practically hear their thoughts. What is she doing here? I thought she vanished. What does she even do these days? I spotted Camille first. She was standing near our mother, who was fussing over a floral centerpiece like her life depended on it. When she saw me, she blinked in surprise before offering a hesitant smile. "You came," she said. "Guess I did." She studied me like she was trying to figure out if I was real. "You look different." I knew what she meant. I looked successful. And that? That didn't fit their narrative. Before she could say anything else, my mother turned, and the moment her gaze landed on me, her expression tightened. "Well," she said, smoothing down the front of her designer dress. "You actually showed up. Nice to see you too, Mom." She scanned me, her eyes lingering on my outfit, my shoes, my watch. Calculating. Trying to piece something together. Dad was already seated at the head of the table, speaking with Camille's fiancé, Andrew. When he noticed me, he lifted an eyebrow but said nothing. I took a seat at the long table, and that's when the real fun began. It started with the little comments. "Must be nice to have all this free time. We weren't sure if you'd remember where we live. I don't even know what you do these days." The last one came from my Uncle Richard, a smug grin plastered on his face. Across the table, Camille gave him a look. "Uncle Richard, what?" He gestured toward me. "I'm just curious. We never hear anything about her. She doesn't call, doesn't visit. The last thing we knew, she ran off too. Where was it again?" Silence. Everyone was watching me now. I glanced around the table, taking in their expectant faces. Then I took a slow sip of my wine, set the glass down, and casually said, "I own this resort." Dead silence. A fork clattered against a plate. Someone coughed. My mother blinked. "You? What?" I gestured around us. "This place. The resort. It's mine." Camille's fiancé let out a short, incredulous laugh, like he thought I was joking. But no one else laughed. Dad frowned. "What are you talking about? I bought this place a few years ago." I shrugged. "Renovated it. Turned it into what it is now." More silence. Then Uncle Richard scoffed. "Oh, come on. You're telling me you own this? This entire place?" "Yeah." I picked up my wine glass again. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Mom's face had gone pale. "You're lying." I smirked. "Am I?" At that moment, the resort's general manager, Lara, happened to pass by. I caught her eye. "Lara," I said. "How's business this season?" She smiled warmly. "Fully booked, as usual, ma'am." "Ma'am." My mother's lips parted. Dad's hands clenched into fists. I could see it now, the way the wheels in their heads were turning. Trying to process this. Trying to figure out how the black sheep, the family failure, the one they had written off, had somehow, ended up owning the very place they chose to celebrate their perfect daughter's engagement. Uncle Richard let out a strained chuckle. Well, I guess you finally did something right." I turned to him, my expression unreadable. "Funny. I don't remember needing your approval." He stiffened. I let my gaze sweep over the rest of the table. "You all spent years treating me like a disappointment," I continued. "Like I was some lost cause. But the truth is, I just didn't want your version of success. I wanted my own. And I found it. Silence. Andrew cleared his throat. That's impressive. Camille looked at me, something complicated flickering across her face. Why didn't you tell us? I met her gaze. Would you have believed me? She didn't answer. My mother suddenly stood. Excuse me, she muttered before hurrying away from the table. Dad sat there, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I leaned back in my chair, the tension thick in the air, and took another sip of wine. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one feeling small. They were. And I had never felt more at peace. The tension at the table was suffocating. My mother had just excused herself, disappearing somewhere into the resort, probably to collect herself after the shock of learning that her failure of a daughter had somehow become a successful business owner. My father, Henry, still sat at the head of the table, staring down at his untouched plate with a clenched jaw. His grip on his wine glass was so tight I half expected it to shatter. Across from me, my Uncle Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if he was debating whether to double down on his usual snide remarks or pretend this conversation never happened. Camille's fiancé, Andrew, cleared his throat. So, you own this place? His voice was careful, measured, like he was trying to figure out if this was a joke or if the reality of the situation was finally sinking in. I set my glass down and nodded. Yes. He glanced at Camille, who was still staring at me like I had just announced I was an astronaut who had been secretly living on Mars. How? She finally asked. I could feel the weight of every eye on me. They wanted a story. A story that made sense to them. A story where I got lucky, or where someone handed this to me, or where I somehow didn't work my BTT off to get here. I wasn't going to give them that. I leaned back in my chair, fingers running over the stem of my glass. I worked for it. Dad scoffed, finally speaking. Worked for it? His tone was full of disbelief, like the idea itself was absurd. Doing what, exactly? I smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Oh, you know. The kind of work you always said was a waste of time. His nostrils flared. Don't start. I'm not starting anything, I said lightly. I'm just stating a fact. The waitstaff moved carefully around us, probably pretending they weren't witnessing the most awkward family confrontation of the year. I could see a few of them stealing glances, exchanging looks. They had all heard what happened. They had all seen the moment my parents went from condescending to stunned. My mother suddenly returned, her expression carefully composed, but I could see the tightness around her mouth. The way she carried herself like someone walking on the edge of a knife. She sat back down, smoothed her napkin over her lap, and spoke with forced calmness. So, she said. You've done well for yourself. It wasn't a compliment. It was a challenge. I met her gaze evenly. Yes, I have. She reached for her glass of wine and took a slow sip, as if giving herself time to decide her next move. And yet, you never thought to tell your family? I tilted my head slightly. Would you have listened? Of course, Dad cut her off with a sharp look. Because he knew the answer. They wouldn't have listened. They would have dismissed me. Told me I was being reckless. That I would fail like they always believed I would. I decided to let the silence drag on, to let them sit in their own discomfort for a moment. Then I turned to Camille. You never told them? Her face flushed. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. I didn't know. I raised an eyebrow. Didn't you? She swallowed hard, avoiding my eyes. That was all the confirmation I needed. She did know. She had heard about me. About my success. Maybe through old friends, maybe through social media, maybe through whispered conversations she didn't want to acknowledge. But she never said anything. Because to acknowledge my success would mean admitting that our parents were wrong about me. I could see it all over her face, the guilt, the realization that she had played along with their narrative for far too long. Uncle Richard let out a forced laugh. Well, I guess that's one way to make an entrance, huh? He glanced around the table, looking for someone to join in. No one did. My father took a deep breath, setting his wine glass down with just a little too much force. So, he said. You bought a resort. And now what? I blinked. What do you mean? What's your plan? He said it like he was waiting for me to admit that I had no idea what I was doing. Is this just some phase? Another one of your big ideas? A slow, amused smile spread across my lips. Oh, Dad. That's the thing. I met his gaze head on. I don't need a plan anymore. I made it. The words landed like a slap. He inhaled sharply, his fingers curling against the tablecloth. Camille was still silent. My mother, ever the composed woman, plastered on a thin smile. Well, isn't that wonderful? She said, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite sarcasm but wasn't sincerity either. I could see it now, she was already figuring out how to spin this. How to reframe my success in a way that didn't completely destroy the image they had built of me. That's when she said it. You know, she continued, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, if you had just listened to us from the beginning, maybe this wouldn't have taken you so long. A laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Not a light chuckle. A real, genuine, are you kidding me laugh. Because of course that's how she would see it. She wasn't proud. She wasn't impressed. She was still convinced that I could have been better if I had just followed their path. My father, emboldened by her words, nodded. She's right, you know. If you had done things our way, I cut him off, my voice calm but firm. If I had done things your way, I would be miserable. The table fell silent again. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table. I didn't do this in spite of you. I did this without you. And that's what bothers you, isn't it? Dad's face darkened. Watch your tone. I smirked. Or what? Uncle Richard muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Camille looked down at her lap, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care. Because I had nothing to prove to them anymore. I had already won. And they knew it. My father's face hardened. I could tell he was struggling, desperately searching for something to say that would put him back in control of the conversation. For as long as I could remember, he had been the one who dictated how things went. How we spoke, how we acted, how we thought. His word was final, his judgment absolute. But tonight, in my resort, at my table, he had lost that power. And he hated it. You think you're better than us now? He asked, his voice low, dangerous. I let the question hang in the air. Camille shifted uncomfortably beside him, her gaze flicking between us like she was watching a BMB about to go off. Mom sighed, shaking her head. No one's saying that. But we all knew that was exactly what they thought I was saying. That was the thing about my parents. They had spent so many years looking down on me that the idea of me standing eye to eye with them, or, God forbid, above them, was something they couldn't process. I tilted my head. You tell me, Dad. Do I seem better to you? His jaw clenched. Enough, my mother cut in, forcing a tight smile. This is Camille's engagement dinner, not some dramatic family reunion. Camille. Right. This wasn't even about me. It was supposed to be her night. I glanced at her, watching as she stared at the table, fingers wrapped tightly around her fork. She wasn't saying anything. She never said anything. Camille, I said, keeping my voice even, do you have something to say? Her head snapped up, eyes wide. Me? She asked, like she wasn't expecting to be pulled into this. Yeah. You. I gestured around. You're the reason we're all here, aren't you? So, what do you think about all this? She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw it, the fear. Not fear of me. Fear of them. Of stepping out of line. Of saying the wrong thing. Of being me. I suddenly felt exhausted. Because I realized something. Camille had never been given the option to stand up to them. Not really. She had grown up in the same house I did, under the same rules, the same suffocating expectations. The difference was, I left. She stayed. She adapted. I took a slow breath. You knew, I said softly. Camille's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. You knew I was doing well, I continued. Maybe not everything. Maybe not that I own this place. But you knew I wasn't a failure. She swallowed. I shook my head. And you never said anything. A flicker of shame passed across her face. Andrew, her fiancé, finally spoke up, clearing his throat. I mean, this is kind of a big thing to keep from your family. Camille shot him a look, but he just raised his hands in surrender. I exhaled sharply through my nose, shaking my head with a small, humorless laugh. Of course, I murmured. Because as long as they thought I was a failure, it was just easier for everyone, right? Camille didn't deny it. She didn't say anything. And that? That told me everything I needed to know. Wow, I muttered, leaning back in my chair. Unbelievable. Okay, Mom said sharply, her voice full of forced calm. That's enough. I looked at her. Enough what? This, she said, gesturing vaguely. The attitude. The accusations. We are still your family. I let out a slow, controlled breath. Are you? Dad pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs screeching against the floor. You want to throw a tantrum? Fine. But don't sit there and act like you're better than us just because you got lucky, I laughed. A real, genuine laugh. Because there it was. Lucky? I repeated. Dad crossed his arms. You think you're some self-made success story? Please. If you had just listened to us, you wouldn't have wasted so many years trying to prove something that didn't need proving. I stared at him, amazed. You really believe that? I said quietly. You actually believe that if I had just followed your rules, I would have had all of this? Yes, he said, without hesitation. And in that moment, I understood something. He would never see me as anything other than a mistake. Because if he did, if he actually acknowledged that I had made it on my own, it would mean admitting that he was wrong about me. And that was something his pride would never allow. I turned back to Camille. You can't even look at me, can you? I asked. She hesitated, then glanced away. That was all I needed to see. I nodded to myself, picking up my wine glass again. Well, I said, swirling the liquid inside. I think we've all had enough honesty for one night, don't you? Mom pursed her lips. Dad's face was unreadable. Camille looked miserable. Andrew just looked like he regretted ever agreeing to this dinner. And me? For the first time in my entire life, I felt nothing. No need to prove myself. No desperate hope that they would finally accept me. Just nothing. And maybe that was a good thing. Because it meant I was finally free. The air at the table was suffocating. The clinking of silverware had stopped. Even the waiters had retreated to the edges of the room, their presence now barely noticeable as they pretended not to witness the train wreck happening at table 7. Camille's engagement dinner had officially turned into something else entirely. No one spoke for a long moment. My mother sat rigid in her seat, her nails digging into the white linen napkin in her lap. My father, still leaning back with his arms crossed, looked like he was trying to decide whether to keep arguing or simply walk away. And Camille just stared down at her plate, her face carefully blank. Her silence said more than any words could. I exhaled slowly, setting my glass down with a soft clink. You know what's funny? I said, tilting my head slightly. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be different. That maybe, after all these years, something would have changed. No one responded. I let out a dry chuckle, shaking my head. Guess not. Dad scoffed. Oh, so now you're the victim? Spare me. I turned to him. Victim? No, Dad. I'm not a victim. But you do seem pretty upset that I'm not the failure you wanted me to be. His face darkened. Excuse me? You heard me. I met his glare without hesitation. You needed me to fail, didn't you? Because if I succeeded, without you, it would mean you were wrong about me. Silence. I could see it, the way his nostrils flared slightly, the slight tightening of his jaw. I was right. And we both knew it. Camille suddenly spoke, her voice quiet but firm. This isn't helping anything. I turned to her, arching a brow. No? What would help, Camille? Me sitting here and pretending like none of this ever happened? Like the last decade of my life didn't exist? She swallowed, avoiding my gaze. You knew, I pressed. You knew I wasn't struggling. You knew I had made something of myself. And yet, you never once spoke up. She hesitated. And that hesitation? It was all the confirmation I needed. Why? I asked, my voice quieter now. Why didn't you say anything? Her hands curled in her lap. Because she cut herself off, shaking her head. It wouldn't have mattered. I stared at her. Wouldn't have mattered? She lifted her gaze to mine, and for the first time that night, I saw something raw in her expression. You don't get it, she said, her voice just above a whisper. You left. You got to leave. I stayed. And I had to live with them. Something in my chest twisted. I opened my mouth, but she shook her head. No, don't look at me like that. Like I'm some victim. Her voice turned sharper. I made my choices. And I made peace with them. But you, she let out a breath, gesturing toward me. You never wanted peace. You wanted to prove something. I leaned forward slightly. And you think that's a bad thing? She let out a bitter laugh. No. I think it's exhausting. That stung more than I cared to admit. But before I could respond, my mother finally spoke. You think this changes anything? Her voice was low, controlled. I turned to her, waiting. You think that just because you made some money, you're different now? She gave a small, humorless smile. You're still the same impulsive, reckless girl who ran off and made a mess of her life. I felt a flicker of something dark in my chest. You really believe that? I murmured. She held my gaze, unwavering. Yes. I exhaled slowly. There it was. The truth. She didn't care what I had built. She didn't care about any of it. Because in her mind, I would always be the black sheep. And nothing would ever change that. I glanced at my father, but his expression was unreadable now. At Camille, who looked like she wished she were anywhere but here. At Uncle Richard, who was sipping his wine, clearly enjoying the drama. I suddenly felt done. For so many years, I had wanted something from them. Validation. Respect. Something. But sitting here, in my own resort, listening to them still belittle me, still dismiss me, I realized something. I didn't need it anymore. I never needed it. I sat back, letting the silence linger. Then, I reached for my wine glass one more time, taking a slow sip before setting it down carefully. Well, I said, my voice calm. I think that tells me everything I need to know. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. And what's that supposed to mean? I simply smiled. Not a smug smile. Not an angry smile. Just a knowing one. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking their approval. I was just watching them. And I had never seen them so small. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the deep red liquid coat the sides before taking another slow sip. I wasn't angry anymore. For years, I had carried this weight, this deep, gnawing need to prove something to them. I had thought that if I built something of my own, if I became successful on my terms, they would finally see me. That they would finally respect me. But now? Sitting at this table, looking at my father's clenched jaw, my mother's carefully composed mask, Camille's downcast eyes, I realized something. They weren't disappointed in me. They were afraid. Afraid because they had lost control of the narrative. I wasn't the failure they had painted me to be. I wasn't some wayward screw-up who would come crawling back, begging for scraps of approval. I was more successful than they had ever imagined. And the worst part? I had done it without them. I set my glass down, exhaling softly. You know, I said, my tone almost conversational, I used to think I needed your validation. I gestured loosely toward my parents. That if I just proved myself, if I showed you I wasn't a failure, you'd finally accept me. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. Dad's fingers twitched slightly against his glass. But I get it now. I gave a small, amused shake of my head. It was never about me failing. It was about you needing me to fail. Camille tensed beside them, but she didn't say anything. You needed me to be the black sheep, I continued. Because if I was the failure, it meant you were right. It meant your way was the only way. Silence. And now? I let out a small chuckle. Now you don't know what to do, do you? Dad scoffed. Don't flatter yourself. I turned to him, my expression unreadable. Flatter myself? Dad, you are the one who can't even look me in the eye right now. He stiffened. Mom cleared her throat, forcing another brittle smile. Well, we are happy for you, dear. I lifted an eyebrow. Are you? She didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. They weren't happy. They were threatened. Because for the first time in their lives, they couldn't control me. I leaned back, exhaling a quiet breath. You know what? I said, standing up and smoothing out my dress. I think I'm done here. Camille looked up sharply. Wait, I turned to her. For a brief second, I saw something in her expression. A flicker of hesitation. Of regret. But not enough. Not enough to make up for the years of silence. So I just gave her a small, knowing smile. Congratulations, Camille. I really do hope you're happy. She swallowed hard, nodding. I looked back at my parents. As for you too. I think we can stop pretending now, don't you? Mom's expression wavered, but she quickly schooled it back into that polite, perfect mask. Dad just stared at me, saying nothing. Good. That meant he finally had nothing left to argue. I turned to the general manager, Lara, who had been lingering a few feet away, pretending not to listen. Lara, I said, my voice smooth, do me a favor? She immediately straightened. Of course, ma'am. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a sleek black card. Make sure their entire bill is covered. A sharp intake of breath came from my mother. I didn't look at her. I just smiled at Lara. And then make sure security escorts them out. Mom shot up from her seat. Excuse me? I turned to her slowly. Oh, don't look so shocked. You came into my home and disrespected me. You thought I would just sit here and take it? Dad finally spoke, his voice sharp. You can't be serious. I tilted my head. Oh, I'm very serious. Uncle Richard let out a laugh, shaking his head. Damn. You're really kicking your own family out? I met his gaze, my smile never fading. Oh, don't worry, Uncle Richard. Your bill isn't covered. His face fell. Lara, ever the professional, simply nodded. Understood, ma'am. Camille stared at me, her face pale. You don't have to do this, I sighed, giving her a small, pitying look. Oh, Camille. That's where you're wrong. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't need to hear their reactions. I didn't need to see the looks on their faces. I already knew, because for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the power. And damn, it felt good. I was sipping a cocktail on the private balcony of my resort when my assistant knocked gently on the doorframe. "Ma'am, there's a request for a reservation under Camille Anderson." I didn't look up. "For how many?" "Just her." I exhaled slowly, setting my drink down. I hadn't spoken to Camille since that night. She hadn't reached out, and neither had my parents. But now, she was here. Alone. "Does she know who owns this place?" I asked. "She does," my assistant said softly. That made me pause. After a moment, I leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Put her in the nicest suite we have." My assistant hesitated. "No charge?" I smirked. "Oh, no. She pays full price." And with that, I picked up my drink again, savoring the taste of victory. Because revenge? Revenge wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about winning. And I had won. Completely.
الغنوة اللي جاية دي حضراتكم هقولوها معايا، يعني انتوا رغبتكم، بس انتوا اول ما هتسمعوها هتعرفوا. انما انا عايز اقول لكم هي كلمات مين؟ هي كلمات الدكتور مدحت العدل والحان خالد حماد وتوزيعه برضه. هنغنيها اول ما تسمعوا الدخول، هتغنوا معانا على طول.